The Bells of Orleton House, a Mr. James story. It was in the autumn of 1913, while cataloguing the papers of the late Canon Whitmore's estate, that I first encountered the manuscript which forms the basis of this narrative. The Canon, a fellow of considerable antiquarian learning, had been rector of Little Wickham for the better part of 40 years, and his study contained what can only be described as a magpie's collection of historical curiosities gathered from the length and breadth of the Cotswolds. The task of sorting through his effects had fallen to me as his literary executor, a duty I had undertaken with some reluctance, knowing the canon's propensity for accumulating documents of questionable significance alongside genuine treasures of local history. His shelves groaned beneath the weight of parish registers, medieval charters, topographical surveys, and correspondence with fellow antiquarians stretching back to his undergraduate days at Worcester College. Yet it was precisely this comprehensive approach to the preservation of historical materials that made his collection so valuable to students of ecclesiastical and architectural history. Among his effects, carefully preserved in a leather portfolio marked simply Orleton House Private Correspondence, I discovered a series of letters which arrested my attention immediately. The correspondence, dating from the summer and autumn of 1897, was between Canon Whitmore and one Dr. Edmund Rayner, Fellow of Corpus Christi College, Cambridge, and concerned certain disturbing events at a country house some 12 miles from Oxford. Rayner's reputation as a scholar was beyond question. His monographs on medieval church architecture and campanology were standard works in their field, and Canon Whitmore himself had been a man of scrupulous honesty and methodical habits of mind. The letters tell a story which, had I not known both correspondents to be of unimpeachable character and sound judgment, I should have dismissed as the product of overwrought imagination or perhaps deliberate fabrication. Yet the documentary evidence is compelling, supported as it is by contemporary parish records, estate documents, and architectural surveys which I have since been able to examine independently. The account which follows is drawn primarily from Dr. Rayner's detailed letters, supplemented where necessary by Canon Whitmore's own observations, and by certain additional materials which came to light during my subsequent investigations. The matter began, innocuously enough, with a commission from Mr. Augustus Cravens, a London businessman who had recently purchased Orleton House, a Tudor manor of some historical significance. Mr. Cravens, being of scholarly inclinations himself, had invited Dr. Rayner to conduct a comprehensive survey of the property's ecclesiastical antiquities, with particular reference to the private chapel and its contents. The house, dating from the late 16th century with earlier foundations, possessed architectural features of considerable interest, not least a detached bell tower whose history presented several puzzling anomalies. Dr. Rayner's first letter to Canon Whitmore, dated June 15, 1897, reveals both the scholarly enthusiasm and methodical approach which characterized his work. The invitation from Mr. Cravens had come through the offices of the Society of Antiquaries, of which both men were fellows, and concerned what promised to be a routine but rewarding investigation into the architectural and historical features of Orleton House. The property, wrote Rayner, presents several puzzles which I believe will reward careful investigation. The main house, built by Sir Thomas Orleton circa 1580 on the site of an earlier manor, incorporates portions of what appears to have been a 13th century foundation. The chapel, connected to the main building by a covered passage but essentially freestanding, dates from approximately the same period as the present house, though its tower may be somewhat older. Local tradition maintains that the Orleton family were recusants during the Elizabethan period, and there are suggestions that the chapel was designed for clandestine Catholic worship, which would explain certain unusual features in its construction. The most intriguing aspect of the commission, however, concerned the chapel bells. The tower housed what appeared to be a complete ring of 5, apparently cast in the early years of the 17th century, yet local memory insisted they had not been rung within living memory. Indeed, the bell chamber itself had been sealed for decades, and no key to the access door had been found among the estate papers inherited by Mr. Cravens from the previous owner. The bells themselves, Rayner continued, are visible through the chamber windows, and appear to be in remarkably good condition despite their long silence. The local blacksmith, a man named Hodges, whose family have served the village for several generations, informed me that his grandfather once told him the bells had been put to sleep during his youth, though he could provide no details as to what this curious phrase might signify. There is also the matter of certain inscriptions upon the bells which I have been able to observe through field glasses, but which present several peculiarities that require closer examination. The commission was to last for 3 weeks, during which time Dr. Rayner would reside at Orleton House as Mr. Craven's guest, with full access to the chapel, tower, and any relevant documents or materials that might assist in his research. Canon Whitmore's reply, preserved among the correspondence, reveals his immediate interest in the project and his eagerness to learn of Rayner's discoveries. "The matter of the sealed bell chamber is particularly intriguing," wrote Whitmore. "I am reminded of similar arrangements at certain churches in the Marches, where bells were deliberately silenced during periods of political or religious turmoil. The practice of sealing bell chambers, however, is less common, and usually indicates some specific prohibition, rather than mere neglect. I shall await your findings with considerable interest, and trust you will keep me informed of any unusual discoveries." Dr. Rayner's second letter, dated June 22nd, provides a detailed account of his arrival at Orleton House and his first impressions of both the property and his host. He had traveled from Cambridge by the Great Western Railway, changing at Oxford for the branch line to Chipping Norton, thence by hired trap through the narrow lanes of the Cotswold countryside. The journey, he noted, had taken him through landscape of remarkable beauty, though marked by an air of ancient melancholy that seemed to intensify as he approached his destination. "The house reveals itself gradually through a screen of elms, as one approaches along the drive," he wrote. "It is a substantial Tudor manor of honey-colored stone, built upon a slight eminence that commands extensive views across the surrounding parkland. The facade presents the characteristic E-plan of its period, with projecting wings and a central porch surmounted by elaborate stonework bearing the Orleton arms. The mullioned windows, many still retaining their original diamond-paned glass, catch and reflect the light in a manner that gives the building an oddly watchful appearance, as though conscious of the observer's approach. The chapel, connected to the main house by a covered passageway but essentially freestanding, occupied a position some 50 yards to the south. Its square tower, rising to a height of perhaps 60 feet, dominated the immediate landscape with an authority that seemed disproportionate to its actual size. The stonework appeared older than that of the main house, though whether this represented an earlier building campaign or merely the use of salvaged materials was not immediately apparent. "There is something distinctly oppressive about the tower," Rayner observed. "Perhaps it is merely the effect of its proportions, which seem calculated to emphasize height at the expense of breadth, or the curious absence of any decorative elements save for the simplest string courses and hood moldings. The bell chamber windows, 4 in number and positioned at the cardinal points, are fitted with iron grills of unusual pattern, not the familiar Gothic tracery one might expect, but geometric designs that suggest a later, perhaps Puritan, influence. Through these grills, one can glimpse the bells themselves, suspended in the chamber like great bronze sentinels awaiting some predetermined signal. Mr. Cravens proved to be a gentleman of middle years, possessed of that restless energy which characterizes the successful man of business, yet tempered by genuine scholarly enthusiasm. He had made his fortune, Rayner learned, in the South African diamond trade, and had purchased Orleton not merely as a country retreat, but with the express intention of preserving its historical associations and architectural integrity. The previous owner, an elderly spinster named Miss Carthew, had been the last representative of a cadet branch of the original Orleton family, and had allowed the property to fall into considerable decay during the final decades of her occupancy. Miss Carthew lived, I am told, as something of a recluse, explained Cravens, as he conducted Rayner on an initial tour of the property. She occupied only a few rooms in the east wing, and large portions of the house had been closed up for 30 years or more. The chapel, in particular, appears to have been abandoned entirely. When I purchased the estate last year, I found the building in a remarkable state of preservation. Indeed, almost as though it had been deliberately maintained in readiness for some future use, despite clear evidence of prolonged neglect. The interior of the chapel, which Rayner was able to examine that first evening, presented a fascinating study in architectural development and religious history. The nave, dating from the late 16th century, retained its original oak pews and rude screen, though the latter had been defaced during what appeared to be the Puritan period. The chancel, however, showed evidence of much earlier work, with sections of carved stonework that could be dated to the 13th or even 12th century. Of particular interest, noted Rayner, are the wall paintings which have been preserved beneath layers of whitewash. Preliminary examination suggests they may date from the late medieval period and depict scenes from the lives of various saints, though the iconography is somewhat unusual. There are also several memorial brasses of exceptional quality, including what appears to be a palimpsest, a brass which has been turned over and re-engraved, presumably during the Reformation period. The original inscription, barely visible on the reverse, makes reference to prayers for the dead and other Catholic observances. It was on the morning of his second day at Orleton that Dr. Rayner began his systematic examination of the bell tower, an investigation that was to prove both fascinating and deeply troubling. The tower interior, accessed through a low doorway in the chapel's north wall, consisted of 3 chambers connected by narrow stone staircases. The lowest chamber at ground level had apparently served as a vestry, though it retained little of its original fittings save for a stone piscina of considerable antiquity. The middle chamber, lit by small lancet windows, was empty save for the massive timber framework that supported the bells above. The bell chamber itself, however, remained tantalizingly inaccessible. The staircase terminated at a heavy oak door, bound with iron and secured by a lock of unusual design. The door appeared to be of 17th century workmanship, but showed no signs of recent use. Indeed, the lock mechanism was so corroded that Rayner doubted whether any key, however perfect, could now operate it successfully. The door presents several curious features, he wrote to Canon Whitmore. The oak is black with age and has warped considerably, yet the iron hinges and lock plates show little sign of rust, as though they had been treated with some preservative compound. Most peculiar of all are the symbols carved into the door itself, not the Christian monograms or decorative motifs one might expect, but geometric patterns that seem almost Kabbalistic in their complexity. Mr. Cravens informs me that he has consulted several locksmiths regarding the possibility of forcing entry, but all have advised against attempting to break the lock, fearing that the mechanism might be booby-trapped in some manner. Unable to enter the bell chamber directly, Rayner was obliged to conduct his initial examination from the exterior, using field glasses to observe the bells through the iron grills that protected the windows. What he saw both fascinated and disturbed him. The ring consisted of 5 bells of varying sizes, suspended from a substantial timber framework that appeared to be in excellent condition despite decades of neglect. The bells themselves were of bronze, their surfaces darkened with age, but showing no signs of the verdigris or corrosion one might expect in such circumstances. Most intriguing of all were the inscriptions cast into the bronze. While traditional bell inscriptions typically consisted of dedication formulae, founders' marks, or biblical quotations, the bells of Orleton House bore legends of a distinctly unusual character. The treble, smallest of the five, carried what appeared to be a date, 1604, together with the name Hieronymus Kellner Fecit. This was puzzling in itself, as no bell founder of that name was known to have worked in England during the early 17th century, though the name suggested continental, perhaps Germanic, origins. The inscriptions on the remaining bells were more disturbing still. The second bell bore the Latin phrase, vox clamantis, in tenebris, a voice crying in the darkness, while the third carried the cryptic legend, hic locus est ubi mors gaude securi vitae. Here is the place where death rejoices to help life. The fourth bell presented the most troubling inscription of all, surget mortui advenit ad judicium, arise ye dead, and come to judgment. The tenor, largest of the five, bore only a single word in Gothic script, malpfus. I confess, wrote Rayner, that these inscriptions fill me with considerable unease. While Latin formulae are commonplace upon church bells, these particular phrases suggest purposes far removed from the normal call to worship or celebration. The reference to Malphas is particularly disturbing, as any student of medieval demonology will recognize this as the name of one of the grand presidents of hell, traditionally depicted as a raven or crow. That such a designation should appear upon a bell intended for Christian worship is almost unthinkable, yet the evidence of my own eyes leaves little room for doubt. The mystery deepened when Rayner attempted to research the history of the bells in the local parish records. The registers, dating back to 1558, made no reference to any bells being installed at Orleton House, nor to any founder named Kellner working in the district. Indeed, the earliest references to the chapel suggested that it had originally been served by a single Sanctus bell of modest proportions, quite different from the substantial ring now housed in the tower. Determined to uncover the truth behind the mysterious bells, Dr. Rayner spent several days examining the parish records of Orleton and the surrounding villages, assisted by the current rector, the Reverend Dr. Pembroke, an elderly gentleman whose knowledge of local history was both extensive and reliable. The search proved more rewarding than he had dared to hope, though the information uncovered served only to deepen the mystery rather than resolve it. The earliest clear reference to unusual activities at Orleton House appeared in the parish register for 1604, the same year inscribed upon the treble bell, under the date of October 31st, All Hallows Eve. The rector of the time, one Master John Whitlock, had made an extraordinary entry. This day did Sir Edmund Orleton cause to be installed in his chapel tower 5 bells of foreign casting, brought hither from parts unknown. Though pressed by myself and others of the parish as to the purpose of these bells, Sir Edmund would vouchsafe no answer save that they were consecrated to purposes which it behooved not common men to know. May God preserve us from the fruit of such undertakings. Further entries in Master Whitlock's careful hand revealed a pattern of increasingly disturbing events throughout the winter of 1605. References to midnight summons and unseasonable gatherings at Orleton House appeared with growing frequency, culminating in a series of entries during the week before Christmas that suggested the young rector was in a state of considerable agitation. December 20th, recorded Whitlock. Again this night the bells of Orleton did sound, though none were seen to approach the tower, nor was any earthly hand observed to pull upon the ropes. The tolling continued from midnight until the hour before dawn, a slow and measured knell that seemed to call forth shadows from every corner of the parish. 3 of my parishioners have fled their homes, declaring they will not remain to hear such summoning again. December 22nd. Sir Edmund came to me this morning in great distress, imploring that I should say masses for the repose of souls departed. When I inquired whose souls required such ministration, he would say only that there were those who walked who should lie still, and others who lay still who should walk. I fear that trafficking with forbidden knowledge has brought some curse upon this house and all who dwell within it. The final entry in Whitlock's hand was dated December 24th, 1604. The bells have fallen silent, but at what cost I dare not set down in writing. Sir Edmund is dead, found in his library at dawn, seated at his desk with no mark of violence upon him, yet aged as though 20 years had passed in a single night. His face bore an expression of such terror that the women would not touch the body. I have ordered the bell chamber to be sealed, and pray God it may remain so until the end of days. These revelations cast an entirely new light upon the mystery of Orleton House. Sir Edmund Orleton, it seemed, had been involved in some form of occult practice, possibly necromancy, which had culminated in his mysterious death and the subsequent sealing of the bell chamber. But why had the bells been allowed to remain in place? Why had they not been removed and destroyed, as one might expect after such disturbing events? The answer came from an unexpected source. Among the diocesan records preserved in the Cathedral Library at Oxford, Dr. Rayner discovered a letter from Bishop William Barlow to Master Whitlock, dated January 15, 1605. The bishop's response to the rector's report of events at Orleton House revealed both the ecclesiastical authorities' awareness of the situation and their reasons for the unusual measures taken to contain it. "We have received your relation concerning the unhallowed practices at Orleton House," wrote the bishop, "and have taken counsel with those learned in such matters. It is their judgment that the bells, being consecrated by unholy rites to purposes contrary to God's will, must not be removed, lest their disturbance should release that which they now contain. The chamber wherein they hang shall remain sealed by authority, both spiritual and temporal, and any who would violate this prohibition do so at peril of their immortal souls." Armed with this historical knowledge, Dr. Rayner returned to his examination of Orleton House with a considerably altered perspective. What had initially appeared to be a routine antiquarian investigation had revealed itself as something far more complex and potentially dangerous. Yet his scholarly instincts, combined perhaps with a natural skepticism regarding supernatural explanations, compelled him to continue his research, despite the disturbing implications of his discoveries. It was during his 6th night at Orleton House that the first unmistakable manifestation occurred. Rayner had retired to his chamber, a comfortable room on the first floor of the east wing, chosen for its proximity to the chapel and its excellent view of the bell tower. At approximately 11 o'clock, after spending the evening in Mr. Craven's library examining estate papers and architectural drawings, he had extinguished his candle and was lying in that state between waking and sleeping when he became aware of a sound that seemed to emanate from the very stones of the building. It began as the faintest of vibrations, he wrote to Canon Whitmore, felt rather than heard, as though some massive weight were being slowly lifted somewhere within the house. The sensation was not unlike that experienced when standing near a large church bell as it begins to toll, though in this case there was no visible source for the disturbance. Gradually, the vibration resolved itself into what I can only describe as the ghost of a bell note, not the clear bronze voice one associates with properly struck bells, but a hollow, muffled resonance that seemed to emerge from the very walls themselves. The sound continued for perhaps 10 minutes, during which time Rayner became aware of other, more subtle phenomena. The temperature in his chamber dropped noticeably, though the October night was mild and his fire had been banked but not extinguished. The flame of his bedside candle, which he had relit to observe his surroundings more clearly, flickered and guttered, as though subjected to invisible draughts. Most disturbing of all, Shadows seemed to move independently of their causes, flowing across the walls and ceiling in patterns that bore no relation to the dancing candlelight. "I am not naturally of a nervous disposition," Rayner continued, "yet I confess that these phenomena produced in me a degree of unease that I found difficult to rationalize. There was something purposeful about the manifestations, as though they were intended not merely to disturb, but to communicate some specific message. The bell note, in particular, seemed to carry with it an unmistakable sense of summoning, as though some presence within the house were attempting to call forth a response. The phenomena ceased as abruptly as they had begun, leaving Rayner in a state of considerable agitation. Sleep proved impossible for the remainder of the night, and he spent the hours before dawn pacing his chamber and attempting to formulate some rational explanation for what he had experienced. By morning, he had almost convinced himself that the incident had been the product of an overwrought imagination, influenced by his recent discoveries in the parish records. This comfortable delusion was shattered when he encountered Mr. Cravens at breakfast. His host appeared pale and haggard, as though he too had passed a sleepless night, and his greeting was subdued and distracted. When Rayner inquired after his health, Cravens hesitated for a moment before replying. "I trust you slept well, Doctor?" he asked, though his tone suggested he expected a negative response. "I fear not," admitted Rayner. "I was disturbed by certain sounds that seemed to emanate from the direction of the chapel. Did you perhaps hear anything unusual during the night?" Craven's relief at this question was evident. "Then, I am not going mad," he said with a rueful smile. "Yes, I heard them too. The bells, though, how such a thing is possible I cannot begin to explain. The sound seemed to fill the entire house, yet when I looked from my window toward the tower, I could see no movement in the bell chamber, no ropes swaying, no figures about the building. It was as though the bells were ringing of their own accord." This confirmation that the phenomena had been objective rather than subjective provided both reassurance and increased cause for concern. If the bells were indeed manifesting some form of supernatural activity, then the historical accounts of their malevolent nature took on a new and troubling significance. Rayner resolved to intensify his investigations, despite the obvious dangers involved. Over the following week, the manifestations at Orleton House increased both in frequency and intensity. The phantom bell notes were heard almost nightly, always beginning at approximately the same hour and following a consistent pattern, a single toll, repeated at intervals of precisely 1 minute, for a duration of exactly 13 repetitions. The sound seemed to penetrate every corner of the building, yet its source remained elusive. Rayner's attempts to trace the phenomenon led him on several occasions to the sealed door of the bell chamber, but the oak portal remained as firmly barred as ever, showing no signs of having been disturbed. More troubling still were the visual manifestations that began to accompany the auditory phenomena. Shadows moved through the corridors and galleries of Orleton House with increasing boldness, no longer content to remain at the periphery of vision, but manifesting as distinct, purposeful shapes that seemed to possess their own agenda. These shadow figures, as Rayner came to think of them, appeared most commonly in the vicinity of the chapel and bell tower, though they were occasionally glimpsed in other parts of the house as well. The entities, for I can think of no better term to describe them, appear to possess a degree of intelligence and intention that distinguishes them from mere phantasms or residual hauntings, wrote Rayner in his increasingly frequent letters to Canon Whitmore. They seem particularly drawn to areas where religious artifacts are displayed, lingering before crucifixes and devotional images with what can only be described as malevolent attention. On 2 occasions, I have observed them manipulating physical objects, moving books, extinguishing candles, and once, most unnervingly, tracing patterns in the dust upon a windowsill that bore an uncomfortable resemblance to the symbols carved upon the bell chamber door. Mr. Cravens, meanwhile, was showing increasing signs of strain under the supernatural siege that had descended upon his property. The successful businessman who had welcomed Rayner with such enthusiasm had transformed into a nervous, haggard figure who started at shadows and spoke in whispers even during daylight hours. He had taken to carrying a crucifix and a small vial of holy water, though these talismans seemed to provide little comfort against the encroaching darkness. I begin to understand why Miss Carthew lived as a recluse, Cravens confided to Rayner during one of their increasingly tense conversations. If she was sensitive to these manifestations, the isolation of her final years becomes perfectly comprehensible. I myself am beginning to feel the weight of some oppressive presence that grows stronger with each passing day. It is as though the house itself has become aware of our presence and regards us as unwelcome intruders. The servants, too, were affected by the supernatural atmosphere. Mrs. Hodges, the housekeeper, complained of objects moving during the night and of strange marks appearing on freshly cleaned surfaces. 2 of the housemaids gave notice without explanation, and the gardener reported that his tools were frequently found in different locations from where he had left them, arranged in patterns that seemed to mock their intended purposes. Most disturbing of all was the behavior of the house's single permanent animal resident, an elderly tabby cat named Griselda, who had belonged to Miss Carthew and had been maintained by the new owner out of sentiment. The cat, previously affectionate and placid, began to display signs of extreme agitation whenever approached. She would arch her back and hiss at empty air, flee from certain rooms for no apparent reason, and refuse absolutely to enter the chapel or any part of the building adjacent to the bell tower. Animals, I am told, are peculiarly sensitive to supernatural influences, observed Rayner, and Griselda's behavior suggests that the manifestations we have observed represent only a fraction of the paranormal activity actually taking place within the house. Her evident terror of the chapel area confirms my growing conviction that the sealed bell chamber is the focal point of whatever malevolent force has taken residence here. Dr. Rayner's determination to uncover the full truth behind the bells of Orleton House led him to undertake an investigation that, in retrospect, proved to be both foolhardy and ultimately catastrophic. Unable to gain access to the bell chamber through conventional means, and increasingly convinced that the inscriptions upon the bells held the key to understanding their malevolent purpose, he resolved to examine them more closely using whatever means were available to him. The solution came through consultation with a local builder, one Tom Ashworth, whose family had served the district for several generations, and who possessed both practical knowledge of the building's construction and access to the necessary equipment. Ashworth, though clearly uneasy about the commission, agreed to provide an erect scaffolding that would allow Rayner to position himself level with the bell chamber windows for the purpose of detailed observation. The bells themselves, Rayner wrote in what would prove to be his penultimate letter to Canon Whitmore, are masterpieces of the founder's art, despite their unhallowed inscriptions. The bronze has acquired a patina of extraordinary beauty, dark green shot with gold, that speaks of centuries of patient oxidation. Yet there is something fundamentally wrong with their proportions. They are too thick for their diameter, too heavy for their intended purpose, as though designed to produce notes of unnatural depth and resonance. The extended examination, conducted over 2 days with the aid of powerful field glasses and supplemented by careful sketches, revealed details that had been invisible from ground level. The inscriptions, as previously noted, were of a disturbing character, but closer inspection revealed additional elements that had escaped earlier observation. Between the main legends, in letters so small as to be barely visible, were carved what appeared to be names, dozens of them, arranged in spiral patterns around the circumference of each bell. The names, continued Rayner, appear to represent individuals from various historical periods, spanning several centuries. Many I recognize from local parish records, members of the Orleton family, certainly, but also other residents of the district who died under mysterious or unfortunate circumstances. There is Margaret Whitlock, daughter of the rector who sealed the bell chamber, recorded as having drowned in the mill pond in 1606, though she was known to be an accomplished swimmer. Thomas Ashworth the elder, ancestor of my current assistant, who was found dead in his workshop in 1623 with no apparent cause. Mary Cravens, who shares a surname with my current host, though he claims no knowledge of the connection. She perished in a house fire in 1641, along with her 3 young children. The implications were horrifying. If Rayner's interpretation was correct, the bells of Orleton House were not merely instruments of some arcane ritual, but repositories for the souls of the dead, a necromantic apparatus of unprecedented scope and malevolence. The inscriptions suggested that Sir Edmund Orleton had somehow managed to bind the spirits of the deceased to the bronze of the bells, creating a collection of enslaved souls that could be summoned and commanded through the act of ringing. But perhaps most disturbing of all was Rayner's discovery of his own name, carved in letters so fresh they seemed to have been cut only days before, spiraling around the tenor bell directly beneath the diabolic appellation Malthus. The knowledge that his own name had been inscribed upon one of the accursed bells filled Dr. Rayner with a terror that no amount of scholarly rationalism could dispel. The implication was clear. Whatever malevolent intelligence controlled the bells of Orleton House had marked him for inclusion in their supernatural collection. The question that tormented him was whether this represented a future threat or an already accomplished fact, whether his name had appeared as a prophecy or as confirmation that his soul had already been claimed. His first instinct was flight. Every rational consideration argued for immediate departure from Orleton House, preferably never to return. Yet scholarly curiosity, combined with a growing sense of moral obligation, compelled him to remain. If the bells truly contained the trapped souls of the innocent dead, then surely some effort should be made to release them from their bondage. Moreover, his abandonment of the investigation might simply ensure that the next antiquarian to examine the chapel would suffer the same fate that apparently awaited him. Mr. Cravens, when informed of Rayner's discoveries, proved surprisingly resolute in his determination to see the matter through to its conclusion. "If what you suggest is true," he declared, "then I have purchased not merely a house but a monument to centuries of suffering. I cannot in good conscience simply close the building and leave matters as they stand. There must be some means of breaking this curse, some way of granting peace to those whose souls have been so wickedly perverted." The answer, when it came, arrived from an unexpected source. Among the papers in Sir Edmund Orleton's library, which had remained largely undisturbed since his death in 1604, Cravens discovered a slim volume bound in black leather and written in a mixture of Latin and English. The book, which bore the title Liber Campanorum Maleficorum, the Book of Evil Bells, proved to be Sir Edmund's own account of his trafficking with forbidden knowledge in the creation of his necromantic apparatus. The text, though often obscure and filled with references to magical practices that neither Cravens nor Rayner fully understood, made clear that the bells had been created as part of an elaborate attempt to achieve earthly immortality through the enslavement of departed souls. Sir Edmund had apparently believed that by binding the essence of the dead to objects of his own creation, he could draw upon their accumulated knowledge and experience to extend his own lifespan indefinitely. "The ritual," wrote Sir Edmund in his crabbed hand, "requireth the summoning of those whose names are graven upon the bronze, that their essence may be drawn forth, and their knowledge absorbed by the practitioner. Yet great care must be taken in the performance, for the souls thus bound are filled with rage and malevolence, and will seek to destroy any who would command them unless properly constrained by word and symbol." The book also revealed the means by which the curse might be broken. According to Sir Edmund's notes, the bells could be neutralized by ringing them in a specific sequence while reciting certain incantations, thereby releasing the trapped souls and allowing them to find their proper rest. The danger, however, was considerable. The ritual required that the practitioner remain within the bell chamber throughout the process, exposed to the full fury of the liberated spirits. It is clear, Sir Edmund concluded, that none should attempt this liberation save one whose own name is graven upon the bronze, for such a one is already claimed by the bells and cannot suffer further harm from their influence. Yet the practitioner must be prepared to sacrifice his earthly existence, for the breaking of the binding will require the offering of a life freely given. The meaning was unmistakable. Dr. Rayner, whose name had appeared upon the tenor bell, was both the only person capable of performing the ritual and doomed to die in the attempt. Despite the horrifying implications of Sir Edmund's revelations, Dr. Rayner found himself strangely at peace with the knowledge of his fate. Perhaps, he reflected, this was the influence of the bells themselves, drawing him inexorably toward the completion of their master's work. Or perhaps, it was simply the scholar's instinct to pursue truth, regardless of personal cost. In any event, he resolved to attempt the liberation ritual, despite Mr. Craven's strenuous objections. The first step was to gain access to the bell chamber, a task that proved surprisingly straightforward once the proper approach had been determined. The symbols carved upon the door, when compared with those described in Sir Edmund's book, revealed themselves to be a form of mystical lock that responded not to any physical key, but to specific incantations spoken in the correct sequence. The words, in a mixture of Latin and what appeared to be Hebrew, felt strange and unnatural upon Rayner's tongue, as though the very act of speaking them was somehow damaging to his soul. The door opened with a grinding of hinges that had remained motionless for 3 centuries, revealing a narrow stone staircase that ascended into darkness. The air that rushed out was stale and cold, carrying with it a strange metallic odor that reminded Rayner unpleasantly of old blood. Behind him, he heard Mr. Craven's gasp in surprise and horror, though whether this was a reaction to the opening of the long-sealed chamber, or to some other manifestation, Rayner could not determine. The bell chamber itself was smaller than he had expected, barely 12 feet square, and dominated by the massive timber framework from which the 5 bells hung in silent menace. The bronze surfaces, which had appeared so beautiful when viewed from a distance, now revealed their true character. The patina was not the natural green of aged copper, but something far more disturbing, a dark, oily sheen that seemed to shift and writhe in the lamplight, as though the metal itself were somehow alive. The inscriptions, too, were different when observed at close quarters. The names of the dead, which had appeared as simple carved letters when viewed through field glasses, now revealed themselves to be something far more sinister. Each letter seemed to pulse with its own faint luminescence, and as Rayner watched in fascination and growing horror, he could see that the inscriptions were not static but slowly changing, new names appearing even as he observed them. Among the fresh additions, he recognized several individuals who had died in the surrounding district within recent memory, their souls apparently drawn into the bell's malevolent influence even during their long period of enforced silence. The ritual itself, as described in Sir Edmund's book, was both complex and deeply disturbing. Rayner was required to ring the bells in a specific sequence, not the traditional changes familiar to any English campanologist, but a pattern that seemed designed to produce maximum discord and unease. The order was precise: first the treble, then the tenor, followed by the second, fourth, and third bells in rapid succession, repeated 13 times while reciting the Latin formulas that would supposedly release the trapped souls. As he grasped the first bell rope, Rayner was immediately aware that something was fundamentally wrong. The rope was warm to the touch, despite the chill of the chamber, and seemed to pulse with a life of its own. Moreover, the weight of the bell was far greater than its apparent size would suggest, as though the bronze had been made dense with more than mere metal. The first toll when it came was unlike any bell note Rayner had ever heard. Instead of the clear, pure resonance one expects from properly cast bronze, the sound was harsh and discordant, filled with undertones that seemed to bypass the ears entirely and strike directly at the nervous system. The note hung in the air far longer than natural acoustics would permit, and as it slowly faded, Rayner became aware of other sounds within its dying echo: whispers, moans, and what might have been distant screaming. The second toll, from the great tenor bell, was even more disturbing. The bronze seemed to vibrate, not merely with sound, but with some more fundamental disturbance that affected the very fabric of reality within the chamber. The air grew thick and oppressive, and shadows began to gather in the corners, despite the bright flame of Rayner's lamp. Most unnerving of all, the temperature dropped so rapidly that his breath began to mist, and frost formed upon the metal surfaces of the bells themselves. As the ritual progressed, the manifestations intensified. The shadows resolved themselves into distinct shapes, human figures that pressed against the walls of the chamber with obvious desperation, their mouths open in silent screams of anguish. These were the souls trapped within the bells, Rayner realized, made visible by the power of the liberation ritual but not yet free to depart. Their faces, when he could bring himself to look directly at them, bore expressions of such suffering and malevolence that his hand trembled upon the bell ropes. The 13th and final sequence proved almost impossible to complete. By this point, the chamber was filled with spectral figures whose presence was so intense that they seemed almost solid. They pressed around Rayner, their ghostly hands reaching toward him with obvious hunger, their voices combining in a chorus of rage and despair that threatened to overwhelm his sanity. The bells themselves had begun to glow with an inner fire that pulsed in rhythm with the tolling, and the inscribed names writhed across their surfaces like living things attempting to escape their bronze prison. It was as he grasped the rope of the final bell, the third, whose inscription proclaimed the resurrection of the dead, that Rayner understood the true horror of Sir Edmund's creation. The ritual was not designed to release the trapped souls at all, but to strengthen their bondage by adding the life force of the practitioner to their number. The liberation he had hoped to achieve was nothing more than a cruel deception, a trap designed to claim the souls of any who might threaten the bell's continued existence. The realization that he had been deceived came too late to prevent the completion of the ritual. As the final toll echoed through the chamber, Dr. Rayner felt a sensation unlike anything he had ever experienced. A cold, creeping numbness that began in his extremities and spread inexorably toward his heart. It was not merely physical sensation that was affected, but something far more fundamental. His very sense of self began to fragment and dissolve, as though his soul were being drawn out of his body by some irresistible force. The spectral figures that had gathered around him during the ritual now pressed closer, their expressions transformed from anguish to triumph. Among them, he recognized faces from his historical research: Margaret Whitlock, Thomas Ashworth, Mary Cravens, and dozens of others whose names were inscribed upon the accursed bronze. But most terrifying of all was the figure that emerged from the shadows near the tenor bell, Sir Edmund Orleton himself. Unchanged by the centuries that had passed since his death, his eyes blazing with malevolent intelligence. "Did you think," spoke the phantom in a voice like wind through autumn leaves, "that 300 years of bondage had not taught us the value of deception? Did you imagine that we would provide the very means of our own liberation to any fool scholar who might stumble upon our secret? Nay, learned doctor, you have served our purpose admirably, and now you shall join our number for all eternity." Rayner tried to speak, to cry out for help, but found that his voice had already been claimed by the bells. His body remained upright, mechanically completing the final gestures of the ritual, but his consciousness was being drawn inexorably into the bronze matrices that surrounded him. He could feel his memories, his knowledge, his very identity being absorbed into the collective entity that the bells had become. Yet even as his individual existence faded, Rayner retained enough awareness to understand the full scope of the horror he had unleashed. The ritual had not merely claimed his soul, but had strengthened the bell's power to influence the living world. The long period of enforced silence was ending, and the accursed instruments would soon be able to extend their malevolent reach far beyond the confines of Orleton House. In the main house below, Mr. Cravens was experiencing his own form of supernatural assault. The businessman had remained in the library during Rayner's ascent to the bell chamber, promising to keep watch and to summon help if needed. As the tolling began, however, he found himself overwhelmed by visions of indescribable horror. Scenes of necromantic rituals, human sacrifice, and soul-binding that represented the accumulated memories of all those trapped within the bells. The visions were so vivid and compelling that Cravens initially mistook them for reality, believing himself to be witnessing events that were actually taking place within the chamber above. Only gradually did he realize that he was experiencing the shared memories of the trapped souls, their consciousness temporarily liberated by the ritual, and seeking any available vessel through which to express their anguish. Among the cascade of images and sensations, one message came through with particular clarity. The ritual must not be allowed to reach completion. If the final bell was tolled the required number of times, the binding that held the souls within the bronze would become permanent and unbreakable, trapping not only Dr. Rayner, but ensuring that the bell's power would continue to grow until it encompassed the entire district. Summoning what remained of his courage, Cravens seized an axe from the collection of antique weapons that decorated the library wall and raced toward the bell tower. The staircase to the chamber seemed to stretch infinitely upward, and with each step the supernatural pressure increased until he could barely force himself to continue. The air itself seemed to resist his progress, growing thick and viscous like some supernatural medium designed to prevent interference with the ritual above. He reached the chamber door just as the 12th sequence of tolling began. Through the opening, he could see Dr. Rayner standing motionless amid the bell ropes, his face vacant, and his eyes reflecting the hellish glow that now emanated from the bronze surfaces. Around him pressed the ghostly forms of the trapped souls, their numbers far greater than Cravens had imagined possible. Hundreds of figures representing centuries of death and suffering in the surrounding countryside. What transpired in those final moments in the bell chamber of Orleton House remains, in many respects, a mystery that may never be fully explained. Mr. Craven's own account, given to the authorities several days later, when he had recovered sufficient composure to speak coherently, was fragmentary and in places contradictory. The trauma of what he had witnessed had clearly affected his memory, and certain details of his narrative strained the credulity of even the most sympathetic listeners. According to Cravens, his arrival in the chamber coincided with the commencement of the 13th and final sequence of the liberation ritual. Dr. Rayner, though apparently still alive, was clearly no longer in control of his own actions. His movements had acquired a mechanical precision that spoke of supernatural compulsion, and his face wore an expression of such vacant horror that Cravens initially doubted whether any remnant of the scholar's consciousness remained within his physical form. The spectral figures that filled the chamber, the souls trapped within the bells, seemed to be engaged in some form of collective effort, their ghostly hands reaching toward Rayner, as though attempting to draw something from his living form. The air itself had become visible, swirling with phosphorescent mists that formed patterns of disturbing complexity around the motionless figure of the scholar. Craven's intervention, when it came, was born more of desperation than of any coherent plan. Raising the antique axe he had brought from the library, he struck at the nearest bell rope with all the force he could muster. The hemp parted under the blow, and the sudden release of tension sent the treble bell swinging wildly on its mounting, its bronze surface striking the timber framework with a cacophony that seemed to shake the very foundations of the tower. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. The spectral figures that had surrounded Rayner recoiled as though struck by physical blows, their forms wavering and beginning to dissipate. The phosphorescent mist swirled faster, forming a whirlwind that seemed to draw the ghostly presences inexorably upward toward the chamber's vaulted ceiling. Most dramatically of all, the bells themselves began to change, their malevolent glow fading as cracks appeared across their bronze surfaces. Dr. Rayner collapsed, as though the strings that had been controlling his movements had suddenly been severed. For a moment, Cravens believed that his friend was dead, but closer examination revealed that the scholar was merely unconscious, his breathing shallow but regular. The chamber itself was rapidly returning to normal, the supernatural cold dissipating, the shadows retreating to their natural corners, and the oppressive atmosphere that had characterized the tower lifting like morning mist. The bells, however, had been fundamentally altered by the interrupted ritual. The bronze surfaces, which had maintained their integrity for 3 centuries, were now covered with a network of hairline fractures that grew visibly wider with each passing moment. The inscriptions that had carried such malevolent power were fragmenting and becoming illegible, the names of the trapped souls fading from view as though being erased by some invisible hand. Within minutes, the decay had progressed to the point where the bells could no longer support their own weight. One by one, they cracked apart completely, sending fragments of bronze cascading to the chamber floor with a sound like bitter laughter. The great tenor bell inscribed with the name of Malphas was the last to succumb, its massive form splitting down the center with a report like thunder before crumbling into dust. Cravens managed to carry the unconscious Dr. Rayner from the chamber before the destruction was complete, but both men bore the marks of their experience for the remainder of their lives. Rayner recovered his physical health within a few weeks, but his memory of the events in the bell chamber remained fragmentary, and he was never again able to pursue his antiquarian researches with the same enthusiasm that had characterized his earlier career. Mr. Cravens, meanwhile, found himself unable to remain at Orleton House, despite the apparent resolution of its supernatural problems. The property was sold within the year to a buyer who demolished the bell tower entirely and converted the chapel to secular purposes. The bronze fragments were gathered up and disposed of in some manner that Cravens never disclosed, though he hinted in later years that they had been buried in consecrated ground with appropriate ceremonies. This account, compiled from the correspondence between Dr. Rayner and Canon Whitmore, and supplemented by Mr. Craven's testimony and my own investigations into the historical background, represents the most complete record available of the events at Orleton House in the autumn of 1897. Whether the reader chooses to accept the supernatural elements of the narrative, or to seek more rational explanations for the documented phenomena is, of course, a matter of personal judgment. What cannot be disputed is that both Dr. Rayner and Mr. Cravens were men of unimpeachable character, whose accounts, however extraordinary, were given in good faith and supported by such physical evidence as survived the destruction of the bells. The historical documentation concerning Sir Edmund Orleton and the sealing of the bell chamber in 1604 is authentic and may be verified by reference to the appropriate parish and diocesan records. Dr. Rayner himself, in his final letter to Canon Whitmore, written some months after his recovery, offered his own reflections on the significance of the Orleton House incident. "I have come to believe," he wrote, "that there exist in this world pockets of ancient evil that persist despite the passage of centuries, waiting for the unwary scholar or the curious antiquarian to disturb their slumber. The bells of Orleton House represented one such repository of malevolence, created by human wickedness and sustained by human suffering. That they were ultimately destroyed is cause for gratitude, but I cannot help but wonder how many similar artifacts remain hidden in the forgotten corners of our ancient land, awaiting their moment to emerge once more into the light. The warning implicit in these words seems particularly relevant in our own age, when the systematic exploration of historical sites and artifacts proceeds at an unprecedented pace. The scholar who would probe the secrets of the past must be prepared to encounter not merely the accumulated wisdom of our ancestors, but also the evidence of their follies and the monuments to their darker impulses. As for Orleton House itself, the property remained empty for several years after Mr. Craven's departure, before being purchased by a London syndicate and converted into a private sanitarium. The patients, I am told, report an unusual sense of peace and tranquility in the grounds, as though some long-standing burden has finally been lifted from the place. The chapel, stripped of its ecclesiastical fittings and converted to a common room, shows no trace of its supernatural history, save for a slight discoloration in the stonework where the bell tower once stood. Yet sometimes, on still autumn evenings when the mist rises from the surrounding fields, the more sensitive residents claim to hear faint sounds drifting across the parkland, not the harsh discord of the accursed bells, but something softer and more poignant, the voices of the liberated dead, singing their gratitude as they pass at last into the peace that had so long been denied them. Whether such reports represent genuine psychic phenomena, or merely the product of imagination influenced by local legend, is a question I leave to others to determine. For my own part, I am content to have preserved this record of Dr. Rayner's experiences, and to ensure that the memory of the bells of Orleton House shall not be entirely lost to posterity. In the words of the ancient motto inscribed above the entrance to Canon Whitmore's study, Veritas temporis filia, truth is the daughter of time. Perhaps, in time, the full truth of these matters will be revealed. Until then, we must be content with such fragments of understanding as we possess, and remember that the past, however distant it may seem, is never entirely beyond the reach of the present. Found among the papers of Canon Whitmore, dated November 1913, and preserved in the archives of the Society of Antiquaries. The identity of the compiler remains unknown, though internal evidence suggests familiarity with both the principles involved and the broader context of late Victorian ecclesiastical scholarship.